Hey everyone, this is Dr. Marcon and welcome to Human Anatomy. We are going to get started with Chapter 1, which is the human body and orientation. So let's get started with some definitions. So first, anatomy. Anatomy is the study of the structure of the human body, whereas physiology is the study of body function. Now notice, usually anything that ends in ology means the study of. So you'll see other words that end in ology. And again, that suffix means the study of. Now there are some subdisciplines of anatomy. We have gross anatomy, which is what we are studying, and we can further divide gross anatomy into regional anatomy and systemic anatomy. We also have surface anatomy as well as microscopic anatomy or histology, histo, tissues. So ology, the study of, histo means tissues, so the study of tissues. We also have other branches of anatomy. There's developmental anatomy, embryology, pathological anatomy or pathology. Patho means disease, so pathology meaning the study of disease. We also have radiographic anatomy and functional morphology. When we talk about terminology, specifically anatomical terminology, it's usually based on ancient Greek or Latin, and this helps provide the standard nomenclature worldwide. So there is a hierarchy of structural organization. First, we start off at the chemical level. So at the chemical level, atoms combine to form molecules, and molecules combine to form the macromolecules, such as carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we can see that, we know that anything organic is carbon-based, so made up of atoms of carbon. At the cellular level, we have structures called cells. So cells and their surroundings are made up of molecules. So the cellular level is made up of these cells and their functional subunits. At the tissue level, so a group of cells make up tissues. And tissues consist of similar types of cells and associated extracellular material. Next is the organ level. Organs are discrete structures made up of more than one tissue, meaning that an organ is made up of multiple tissue types. Next, we have the organ system level. We have a bunch of organs working together for a common purpose. So we know that an organ system is a unified group of organs and tissues that will perform a specific function. Examples of the different systems include the cardiovascular system, or the respiratory system, the digestive system. So we have a bunch of different organs working together to perform a common goal. And then a group of systems will then make up an organism. So now we have the organismal level. This is the result of all simpler levels working in unison. And here is just a figure within your book in Chapter 1 showing the different levels and then the hierarchy of these different levels. So we have the chemical level. We can see that atoms make up molecules. So in this example, we have carbon. We also have hydrogen, and a bunch of different atoms coming together to form a molecule, in this case hemoglobin, which is a type of protein. And we know that a protein is a specific type of macromolecule. Then we have the cellular level, and then a group of cells make up tissues, and then a group of specific tissues make up an organ. And then we have the organ system level. This is when we have a unified group of organs and tissues performing a specific function, making up the organ system. And finally, the organism as a whole. So the whole person is the most complex level of organization, and this is the organismal level, and it results from the simpler levels working interdependently. So then we're going to get into the different systems. First, we'll talk about the integumentary system really quick, just an overview. We know that the integumentary system forms the external body covering. So we're talking about the skin and different components of the skin. So we know that the skin is actually the largest organ. The integumentary system protects deeper tissues from injury. We know that the integumentary system is responsible for synthesizing vitamin D. And also it is the site of our cutaneous receptors, such as receptors for pain, pressure, as well as the site for sweat and oil glands. Really quick, next we have the skeletal system, our bones. So the skeletal system protects and supports body organs. It provides a framework for our muscles. We know that our blood cells are formed within bones, and also this is the site of mineral storage. Next system is the muscular system. Our muscles allows for the manipulation of the environment, allows for movement or locomotion. We have specific muscles for facial expression. Our muscles help us maintain posture, and we also know that the muscular system produces heat. A very generalized overview of the nervous system. So the nervous system is a fast-acting control system. It helps respond to both internal and external changes. Our endocrine system. Our endocrine system is made up of glands, and glands secrete hormones that help regulate things such as growth, reproduction, as well as nutrient use. The cardiovascular system and the structures within the cardiovascular system include the heart as well as the blood vessels. We know that blood vessels will transport blood. Blood carries oxygen and carbon dioxide. It also carries nutrients and waste. We know the heart is a specific type of muscle that pumps blood through blood vessels. Our lymphatic system as well as our immune system. This system picks up fluid leaked from blood vessels. It disposes of debris in the lymphatic system. This is where we find our white blood cells, also known as our lymphocytes. The lymphatic system, as well as the immune system, mounts attacks against foreign substances within the body. The respiratory system. The respiratory system keeps blood supplied with oxygen, and we need oxygen to live. It also removes products of waste products of metabolism, specifically carbon dioxide. We know that gas exchange occurs through the walls of air sacs in the lungs. Digestive system. The digestive system helps break down food into absorbable units. We have our large macromolecules such as our lipids, our proteins, and our carbohydrates. We have enzymes that break down these macromolecules so that we can form smaller units that can be absorbed. And we know that anything that we don't digest, so any indigestible foodstuffs, will be eliminated as feces. The urinary system. Urinary system is very important because it helps us eliminate nitrogenous waste. Also helps regulate water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. The male and female reproductive systems. So the overall function is, of course, to produce offspring. We know that the testes produce sperm and male sex hormones such as testosterone, whereas the ovaries produce eggs and female sex hormones such as estrogen. And we have mammary glands that produce milk. So just a quick overview with regards to measurements. We use the metric system to measure length, volume, and weight. So the system of measurement in anatomy, of course, is the metric system. We go by meters, micrometers. This is for length, And then for volume, we have liters and milliliters, and for weight, we use kilograms and grams. And that's about it for the metric system for now. All right, so now we are going into gross anatomy and different regional and directional terms. First, we're going to discuss anatomical position. Anatomical position is a common visual reference point. This is when a person is standing up. So the person stands erect with feet together, usually about shoulder length apart, eyes forward. The person will then have their palms face anteriorly with the thumbs pointed away from the body. So that would be anatomical position. Tomorrow, I want you guys to demonstrate for me. Not tomorrow, but during our first lab session, I want you guys to demonstrate for me anatomical position. So be prepared to show me what anatomical position is. So just some regional terms, we have the axial region. The axial region forms the axis of the body. This includes the head, the neck, and the trunk. We then have the appendicular region. These form the appendages, such as our upper limbs and our lower limbs. Now, it's very important that you guys get comfortable with standard directional terms because these are used by professionals to describe location of one body part in relation to another. And this next figure will show you what anatomical position looks like, as well as the different regional terms. So again, we have the axial region. We know that the axial region is formed by the head, the neck, and the trunk. Okay, and then we have different terms within the axial region. So for example, within the head, also known as cephalic region, we have the frontal region, so frontal where the frontal bone would be, orbital where the eyes would be, nasal. We have oral where the mouth is, mental, and that is the lower part of the jaw or the mandible. And then the cervical region describes the region of the neck. And then within the trunk, we have the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic regions. Okay, and we can actually see that it is color coordinated. So for example, orange represents the thorax. This is a purplish color, represents the abdomen. And then in the next slide, we'll see the dorsum or the back portion of the trunk or the axial region. Okay? And then be familiar with these terms within each region. And then we have parts of the appendicular region, so parts of the upper limb and the lower limb. We know that the hand is part of the upper limb. So here are some terms that help describe parts of the upper limb. So for example, the acromial part of the upper limb, that is where we can find the acromial process. When we get to bones, that'll make a lot more sense. The antecubital region, this is sort of that elbow portion where we do a lot of our blood draws. And then manus means hands, so of course that is part of the hand there. Lower limb, we have the femoral area. This is where we can find the femur, a very important bone. Patellar region, this is where the kneecap or the patella is located. And then the pedal or foot area, and then we have the different parts of the foot, such as the tarsal or the ankle, because we know that tarsal bone is actually located there. So from this posterior or dorsal view, we can see both the axial and appendicular regions. So axial, still part of the trunk, is the dorsal or back, and then we have the different regions within the dorsal area. And then we can see more of the appendicular regions of the upper limb, the hand, the lower limb, and the foot. So directional terms are used to explain precise location of body structure in relation to another body structure. And usually these terms are paired with their opposite. So for example, we have the term superior. Superior, if you actually look at superior, it has the word up in it. So superior means above or up, whereas its opposite would be inferior or below. And then we have anterior. Anterior usually means towards the front, whereas posterior means towards the back. Medial. Medial means towards the midline of the body. So imagine a line that will separate the body into right and left halves. So medial means towards that midline of the body, whereas lateral would be away from that midline. And then we have superficial, means towards the surface, and then deep means away from the surface or deeper to the surface. And this table actually gives the different terms as well as a really good explanation of the different terms. So the first term again, superior or cranial, towards the head. So superior means towards the head or upper part of a structure or the body or above. For example, the head is superior to the abdomen. Opposite of that is inferior. Another word for inferior is caudal. Caudal means towards the tail, if we as humans had a tail, or towards the bottom. So inferior means away from the head or toward the lower part of a structure of the body, also below. So for example, the intestines are inferior to the liver. So here we see the liver, and inferior to that would be the intestines. Medial. Again, medial is towards or at the midline of the body. So imagine a line separating the body into equal right and left halves. Medial would be going towards that midline. Also, it can mean on the inner side of. So for example, the heart is medial to the lungs. Okay, so here is the heart, meaning it's more towards the midline as opposed to in relation to the lungs here, which are more lateral. So the heart is more medial, whereas the lungs would be more lateral. So lateral means away from the midline of the body or on the outer side of. So the thumb is lateral to the pinky. Okay, so we know the pinky is actually more towards, if we're in anatomical position, is more towards the midline of the body, whereas the thumb is away from that midline. Proximal. Proximal means closer to the origin of the body part or the point of attachment of a limb to the body trunk. So for example, the elbow is proximal compared to the wrist. Okay, so we know that the upper limb attaches here at the shoulder, so we would consider the elbow closer to that attachment. So closer or proximal, more proximal to the shoulder compared to the wrist. And if we were talking in anatomical terms, we would consider the wrist more distal. So distal is the opposite of proximal, meaning farther from the origin of a body part or the point of attachment of a limb to the body trunk. Another example of this is the knee. The knee is more distal compared to the thigh. So we know that the lower limb attaches here at the hip. The knee would be more distal compared to the thigh right here. Okay, so other terms, ipsilateral. Ipsi means on the same side. So for example, the right hand, if we're looking at this person, so this would be right, this would be left. The right hand is considered ipsilateral with the right foot because they are on the same side. So that is ipsilateral. Contra means opposite. So contralateral would mean on the opposite side. So the right hand and the left foot are considered contralateral. Okay. So next term we have is anterior. We know that anterior means toward or at the front of the body or in front of. So if we can see the actual skeleton, we know that the sternum, which is part of the rib cage, the sternum is more anterior to the heart. Opposite of anterior, so actually if we are looking through a transverse section of the chest. So here is the heart, and if this is anterior, here is part of that sternum, which is more anterior compared to the heart. Okay, so anterior, another name for anterior is ventral. So ventral means towards the front, or in front of. Opposite of anterior is posterior, which means toward or at the back of the body or behind. Another word for posterior is dorsal. So think of the dorsal fin of a dolphin. This is located on the back of the dolphin. So an example of posterior, the vertebra is posterior to the heart. So if we're looking at this transverse section again, here we see part of the spinal cord or the vertebrae. Vertebra is singular, vertebrae is plural. So the vertebra is posterior compared to the heart, and we know that the sternum is anterior or in front of the heart. Okay. Next term is superficial. Another word for superficial is external. So this means it's toward or at the body surface. So we know the skin is more superficial compared to the skeletal muscles. So it's the outer covering. And opposite of that is deep or internal. So this means away from the body surface or more internal. We know that the lungs are deep to the skin. So then we get into the different planes and sections of the body. The first plane we're going to talk about is the frontal or coronal plane. This plane lies vertically and divides the body into anterior and posterior parts. So imagine a plane separating the front part of your body from the back part of your body. So this is also known as the frontal or coronal plane. So these two terms are synonymous. The next plane is a transverse plane. Transverse plane runs horizontally and can divide the body into superior and inferior parts. So imagine a magician. A trick of most magicians is sawing someone in half. So if we had a person being sawed in half, and they are divided into upper and lower parts, this would be within the transverse plane. Okay. Next plane is the sagittal plane. So sagittal planes are vertical and divide the body into right and left parts. Now, if we have a sagittal plane that will divide the body into equal right and left parts, this is also known as the median or mid-sagittal plane. So this plane runs along the midline. So that midline, again, being that line that separates the body into equal right and left parts, or right and left halves, okay? Whereas the parasagittal plane, parasagittal is a sagittal plane that will be offset from the midline, so does not divide the body equally into right and left halves, but is actually off of that mid-sagittal plane. Okay, so here we can actually see the different planes of the body. Here we have that frontal plane, which separates the body into anterior and posterior, or front and back parts. And then we have the transverse plane. Again, imagine the magician sawing a person in half, separating the body into superior and inferior parts. And then we have the mid-sagittal plane, or median section. So the mid-sagittal plane is that plane that will divide the body into equal right and left halves. Okay? So if we look at some of these imaging studies, we can see the different planes or the different cuts that are being performed. So for example, here we can see a frontal section. So if we have a frontal section, we can actually see parts of, in this example, the torso. So we can see parts of the lungs, the heart, here's the liver. So that is within the frontal plane. A mid-sagittal plane, we can see half of the body. And we can see the different organs as well as structures when the body is cut through that mid-sagittal plane. Transverse section, again, think of a magician sawing a person into upper and lower parts, or superior inferior parts, and we can see transverse section If it's in the middle here, we can see parts of the liver, parts of the pancreas, maybe some intestine. We can see the spleen. So the spleen would actually be on the left side. So here we're looking at, imagine we're looking from below this section. So we're looking a transverse section, but looking from below up. And we can see that the spleen is on the left, and this is a large part of the right lobe of the liver. So the schematic or the human body plan is basically, it's a tube within a tube. The body exhibits bilateral symmetry. We basically have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. We also have notochord and vertebrae, segmentation, and pharyngeal pouches. This all occurs embryologically. And most vertebrates have this basic body plan. So for example, we look at a fish. And we have, specific structures that are shared among all vertebrates. So we have that inner tube. We have a dorsal hollow nerve tube here, which could be a rudimentary, brain and spinal cord for this fish. We have segmented outer tubes. And we have a digestive tube. We have pharyngeal pouches. Here we can see a rudimentary heart and then a notochord. And we actually can see this in a regular human embryo as well. So we have our inner tube, which ends up becoming our digestive system. We have that nerve tube that will eventually become our brain and spinal cord. And then also other different structures that can be compared to other vertebrates. So this is in a human embryo about 5 weeks post-conception. Here we have an adult, and we can see those structures and the adult structures that are formed. So from that dorsal hollow nerve tube, we have our central nervous system, which includes our brain and spinal cord, our inner tube making up the different parts of the digestive system, segmented outer tubes. Here we can see muscle segments or muscles between ribs, and we don't really see the notochord. So the notochord embryologically is a stiffening rod in the back just deep to the spinal cord, but in adults the complete notochord will eventually become or be replaced by vertebrae. And then some of the notochord does persist as the cores of the discs or between the vertebrae or the intervertebral discs. So the body is made up of different body cavities and membranes. The first body cavity we talk about is the dorsal body cavity. The dorsal body cavity is then made up of a cranial cavity as well as a vertebral cavity. And we'll see pictures of this in just a little bit. So opposite dorsal is ventral. So ventral toward the front. The ventral body cavity is then made up of the thoracic cavity, which will be divided into 3 parts. We have 2 lateral parts, each containing a lung surrounded by a pleural cavity. And then we have the third, which is the mediastinum. The mediastinum will contain the heart surrounded by the pericardial sac. Also within the ventral body cavity, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity. And the abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into 2 parts. We have the abdominal cavity, which will contain the liver, the stomach, kidneys, and other organs. And then we have the pelvic cavity, which contains the bladder, some of the reproductive organs, and the rectum. So the next picture will show you the different body cavities. So we have this dorsal cavity, so again, dorsal towards the back or posterior. The dorsal body cavity will contain the cranial cavity, which of course houses the brain, and then the vertebral cavity, which will contain the spinal cord. Okay, and we can see that the dorsal body cavity is indicated by the yellow areas. Then the ventral body cavity, which is more anterior, contains the thoracic cavity with 3 subcavities. we have 2 lateral cavities as well as the mediastinum, again housing the heart and lungs. And then we have this muscle right here which separates this thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. This muscle is called the diaphragm, and diaphragm is of course very important, especially as a muscle used for respiration. So then we have our abdominal cavity. Actually, it's the abdominal pelvic cavity, which will then be divided into abdominal cavity containing digestive viscera. Whenever you see the word viscera, think organ. So abdominal cavity actually contains digestive organs. Okay, and then we have the pelvic cavity, which will contain the urinary bladder, our reproductive organs, as well as the rectum. And here we just see a lateral view of the different cavities, the dorsal and ventral cavity. Again, dorsal being posterior, ventral being anterior. Here we see an anterior view. Again, we can mostly see the ventral body cavities, but we can actually see parts of the dorsal body cavities made up of the cranial and vertebral cavity. So here we see thoracic cavity, again having those cavities that contain the heart and lungs. We have that muscle, the diaphragm, separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And again, abdominal cavity containing digestive organs, pelvic cavity containing urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the rectum. And all these red areas are part of the ventral body cavity, or the body cavity that is more anterior to the body. So serous cavities, they are slit-like spaces that are lined by a serous membrane. We have examples of these include the pleura, the pericardium, and the peritoneum. Now, each of these serous cavities have basically the same structure. We have a parietal serosa and a visceral serosa. Okay, so imagine a balloon. You have a balloon, and imagine making a fist and punching that balloon. Okay, or putting your fist within that balloon. So as you are putting your fist in the balloon will kind of surround your fist. Now, the layer of the balloon that is actually touching your fist, this layer is known as the visceral layer. In this case, it's serosa. So the visceral serosa is the part of the serous cavity, or that lines, that is adhered to the actual organ. So viscera, visceral means organ. So the visceral serosa, or the visceral layer, is the layer that will be adhered to or closely attached to the organ. You then have a space, and then you have that outer part of the balloon. Now, this outer part, or outer layer, will actually make up the outer wall of the cavity, and this is known as the parietal layer, or the parietal serosa. Okay? And again, this makes up that outer wall, or that outer layer that doesn't touch the actual organ, but it's still on the outer part. And then within that space between the two layers, you have fluid called serous fluid. Serous fluid is produced by both layers of the serous membranes. So the first serosa we're going to talk about is the serosa associated with lungs. They're called the pleura. Okay. So here we have the lung, or the organ, and surrounded by the two layers of the serous membrane. So the one layer that's closely attached to or adhered to the lungs, that would be considered the visceral pleura. And then you have the space, which is the which contains the serous fluid, or the pleural fluid. And then you have that outer layer, and that's the layer that lines the thoracic cavity, and that is known as the parietal pleura. Okay. And then that space is known as, between the two layers, is known as the pleural cavity, and that's where we have serous fluid. And this fluid is very important because it actually allows the two layers to kind of slide past one another, especially with the lungs, because we know that the lungs expand when we bring air into the lungs, and then they will retract when we blow air out of the lungs, and movement between the two layers is possible because of that serous fluid within the pleural cavity. So serous membrane associated with the heart, or serosa associated with the heart, is also known as the pericardium. Again, we have the visceral pericardium. That is the layer that is adhered closely to the actual heart, or to the actual organ. And then you have this outer layer here, that is the parietal pericardium. And the space between the two layers is the pericardial cavity, which contains serous fluid. And then within the abdomen, we have serosa associated with the abdominal organs. This is called the peritoneum. Again, the layer of the peritoneum that is adhered to the organs, this is known as the visceral peritoneum. We then have a peritoneal cavity containing the serous fluid, and then we have the outer layer of the peritoneum, which lines the abdominal walls. This is the parietal peritoneum. Okay. So again, I like to use this example of a balloon. Imagine your fist kind of going through or punching into a balloon, and we have part of the balloon that is, touching your fist. This is actually comparable to visceral serosa, or the layer that is, adhering to your fist. And then you have this outer layer which will line the cavity wall. This is the parietal serosa. And then you'll have that serous cavity where serous fluid will be located to allow for sliding of the two layers past one another. Now we can use quadrants to kind of divide specific areas within the abdomen. Quad means 4. So an abdominal quadrant will divide the abdomen into 4 areas. Okay, so we have the right upper quadrant and the left upper quadrant. We also have the right lower quadrant and the left lower quadrant. Now we use quadrants to help us get an idea of where we can locate specific structures, specifically abdominal organs. We know that, for example, the appendix is located in the right lower quadrant. So we'll use quadrants to help us locate different organs. So here we see the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, then we have the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. So here we can see the appendix coming off the cecum is located within the right lower quadrant. Okay. We use abdominal regions. There are 9 regions to actually help us specifically locate different organs, and it's just a little bit smaller, so a smaller area helps us locate specific, very specific organs within the abdomen. So the first part of our lab, we are going to be using microscopes. Fortunately for you, you don't have to go into lab and actually, hold and touch a microscope. Actually, it's not very fortunate. It's better if you get hands-on experience with a microscope. But anyways, so microscopy is examining small structures through a microscope, and we have different types of microscope. We have a light microscope, or light microscopy, which illuminates tissue with a beam of light. This occurs at a lower magnification. And then we have electron microscopy, which uses beams of electrons, and we can see things at a higher magnification. So we can see 3 types of microscopy on this slide. So we can see with a light micrograph at 190x, we can see the different cells here, including this apical surface, the different cells, and then the different structures within the cells, such as the nuclei. And then if we use transmission electron micrograph, we can actually see these cells at a higher magnification. And then at an even higher magnification, we can use a scanning electron micrograph. In order to see these structures, we have to prepare the specimens, and we have to prepare specifically human tissue for microscopy. Basically, the specimen will be fixed or preserved and then sectioned off. When I worked at Boston University School of Medicine, I actually had to prepare slides of sections of brain, which was kind of cool. I got to slice brains for, 3 years. After slicing them and placing them on fixed slides, we would then run them through different stains so we can see the different structures within the tissue. So a specimen is stained to distinguish anatomical structures. We can use an acidic stain, which uses negatively charged dye molecules, or a basic stain, which uses positively charged dye molecules. Now, a scanning electron microscope or scanning electron microscopy, basically we need to use a heavy metal salt stain, which will then deflect electrons in the beam to different extents. When you look at slides, you may run into something called artifacts. So artifacts are minor distortions of preserved tissues, are not exactly like living tissues and organs. Sometimes if you don't use proper handling techniques, you might find dust or dirt, or maybe a piece of string or hair, or so that's why you should always wear gloves and make sure you have proper PPEs when you are handling slides. So when we are discussing clinical anatomy, it is important to discuss different medical imaging techniques. And these are important because these are ways we visualize anatomy. The first most common imaging technique we'll talk about is an X-ray. An X-ray is basically electromagnetic waves of very short length, and they are used best for visualizing bones as well as abnormal dense structures. So here we can see on the left an X-ray or a radiograph of the chest. We can see that the lungs are filled with air, so they are going to look black. However, denser structures such as bone will actually absorb the X-rays, and then they will show up as radio opaque, so a white color, so we can see the bones within the chest. Now, if we use a contrast, we can actually visualize structures a little bit better. So contrasts such as barium. We ask a patient to swallow barium, or we introduce barium through the rectum. These will also kind of absorb the X-rays, and then we can see the internal structures a lot better with barium contrast medium. Okay, and here we can actually see the lower part of the gastrointestinal system. We can see parts of the colon. So on the right, we can see the part of the cecum, the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, the sigmoid colon, down to the rectum, which is pretty cool. Other X-ray techniques or advanced X-ray techniques, we have a CT or CAT scan. So this stands for computed axial tomography. This takes successive X-rays around a person's full circumference. The computer will then translate the recorded information into a detailed picture of the body section. So we have a patient going into the CT scan, lying down usually, and then it takes transverse cuts of the body so that we can visualize the different organs within the body. So here specifically, we can see part of the liver, we can see part of the different vessels. We can even see a kidney here, part of the thoracic vertebrae, the spleen, which would be on the left, and then this is the aorta, a very major blood vessel which transports oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. Another advanced X-ray technique is angiography. or angiography. Angio means vessel, so basically we are taking graphic representations or recordings of vessels. So we contrast medium highlights vessel structures. We use digital subtraction angiography or DSA. So images will be taken before and after contrast medium is given to a patient. And then the computer will subtract before from after to identify any blockage of arteries to the heart wall and brain. And here we see a beautiful picture of DSA. And you know, if we look at, so these are pictures of the coronary artery, we can actually see a narrowing of an artery here. And we know that this is arterial supply of the heart. So if you have a narrowing, that means there's less blood going to the different parts of the heart, which could cause some damage. Other advanced X-ray techniques include PET scan or positron emission tomography. This forms images by detecting radioactive isotopes injected into the body. We also have ultrasound or sonography. This is ultrasound imaging. The body will be probed with pulses of high-frequency sound waves that echo off the body's tissues. We know that ultrasound is an imaging technique which will be used to determine the age of a developing fetus. So the next slide shows PET scan. We use this to kind of follow a patient with regards to, you know, before and after treatment. So here we can see the PET scan before treatment. We can see the different tumors that are visible here in the right breast. And then in here we can see one in the liver. And then after treatment we can see that the tumors might have shrunk or are no longer visible. Then we have ultrasound, of course, which shows images of the fetus within the uterus. We can see the head right there and the body. Another advanced X-ray technique is an MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging. This produces high-quality images of soft tissues, helps distinguish body tissues based on relative water content. And here we can see different MRIs. We can see an MRI of a knee, a sagittal section. We can see the meniscus, that structure between the distal portion of the femur and the proximal portion of the tibia. And it will help us determine if there are any tears in the meniscus. Here we can see an MRI of the head, so we can see different images of the brain. Here's the cerebellum. So pretty cool. So we use these imaging techniques to help see the different anatomical structures within our body, and it's important to know the different types of imaging techniques that are out there. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1, and congratulations, you have completed your first lecture.